A scroll has sat in the British Museum since 1839. Nobody was looking for giants when they catalogued it. They were cataloguing a training letter, a piece of scribal homework from 3,300 years ago. Then someone actually read what it said. Buried inside this letter is a description of a people encountered in Canaan, measured in cubits, standing taller than any ordinary man had a right to stand, 6 feet 8 inches at the short end, 8 feet 6 at the tall end. Written by an Egyptian scribe with no reason to lie, no religious agenda, no Bible to defend. 3 centuries before Moses is even said to have lived. The Bible calls beings like this Nephilim, fallen ones. And for 3,000 years, the only place you could read about them was Scripture, not anymore. If this scroll says what researchers think it says, it isn't just an interesting footnote. It's independent, non-biblical, contemporary corroboration for one of the most mocked claims in the entire Old Testament. If Egyptian scribes were writing home about giant tribes in the exact same region the Bible places them, then the story stops being something you have to take on faith. It becomes something you can cross-check against a source that had nothing to gain by agreeing with Genesis. And if that's true, it forces a harder question. Not whether the Bible got this one detail right, whether everything else it says about what walked the earth before the flood deserves a second look. Think about how rarely that opportunity actually comes along. Most of the Bible's most debated claims, the flood itself, the parting of a sea, a resurrection, simply can't be checked against an outside document, because nothing outside the text exists to check them against. This is different. This is a case where an entirely separate civilization, writing for entirely separate reasons, happened to leave behind a record that lands close enough to the biblical claim to actually be compared side by side. That doesn't happen often in ancient history, and when it does, it's usually treated as a serious event worth taking seriously, not dismissed before the comparison is even made. Its name is Anastasi I. The document is a papyrus letter, written by a scribe named Hori to a colleague named Amenemope, dated to Egypt's New Kingdom period, roughly the 13th century BC. It's been sitting in the British Museum's collection since 1839, acquired from an antiquities dealer named Giovanni d'Anastasi, which is where the scroll gets its name. For most of its history, Egyptologists studied Anastasi I for exactly the reason it was written. It's a satirical training exercise, one scribe testing another's knowledge of the roads, terrain, and logistics of Canaan. Dense, technical, unglamorous. The kind of document that sits in a museum for 2 centuries, getting cited in footnotes and nowhere else. Giovanni d'Anastasi, the dealer whose name the scroll carries, wasn't a random antiquities trader. He served for decades as the Swedish and Norwegian consul general in Egypt during the early 1800s, using that position to assemble one of the largest private collections of Egyptian papyri in the world. When his collection was eventually sold off, museums across Europe split the holdings, which is why there isn't just one Anastasi. Papyrus in circulation today, there are several, numbered in sequence, each covering different subject matter, from magical spells to administrative records to, in this case, a scribe's exam. Then a research group called Associates for Biblical Research went back through it with a different question in mind, and one passage stopped them cold. In it, Hore describes encounters with a people called the Shosu. He gives their height directly, in cubits, 4 cubits, some of them, 5 cubits, others. An Egyptian cubit measured roughly 20 inches. Run that math, and you get a range starting around 6 feet 8 inches and reaching as high as 8 feet 6. Not a folk tale, not a campfire exaggeration, passed down for centuries before anyone wrote it down. A working military and geographic letter written by a professional scribe, describing a specific people by name, giving their height as a plain fact. He expected his reader to find useful. The letter itself is about war. It describes hostile terrain, difficult passes, the challenges of moving through a land that fought back. And in the middle of listing those challenges, Hori tells his reader exactly how big the men were that Egyptian soldiers had to face. Context matters. Here too, the New Kingdom period this letter comes from was Egypt's imperial high point, an era when pharaohs like Thutmose III and later Ramesses II campaigned repeatedly through Canaan, treating it as a contested buffer zone between Egypt and its rivals to the north. Scribal training letters like this one weren't idle exercises. They were preparing the next generation of military administrators for real deployments into exactly the terrain being described. A scribe who couldn't correctly picture the roads, the water sources, or the size of the people he might encounter wasn't just failing an exam. He was being judged unfit to support a real campaign. That's part of why this detail carries more weight than a casual traveler's tall tale would. Hori wasn't writing to impress a general with a good story. He was training a colleague to survive. The Bible was already telling this story. Numbers chapter 13 records Israelite spies sent into Canaan, the exact region Hori's letter describes, returning with a report that terrified the entire camp. They described people of such size, the text says, that the Israelites felt like grasshoppers standing next to them. Deuteronomy chapter 3 goes further, describing a specific king named Og, ruler of Bashan, and his iron bed, measured at 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. At 20 inches per cubit, that's a bed frame stretching 15 feet. Even accounting for ceremonial exaggeration around a king's furniture, that's not a bed built for an ordinary man. Worth being fully honest about that bed too, because the translation itself is genuinely contested. The Hebrew phrase is Eres Barzel, and while the standard rendering is iron bed, a meaningful number of scholars argue it more likely describes a basalt sarcophagus, a dark volcanic stone coffin common to the Bashan region and sometimes described using the same root word associated with iron because of its dark color and weight, not its literal material. If that reading is correct, the 15-foot object wasn't necessarily a bed-sized for a living giant at all. It may have been a funerary monument, its scale reflecting royal status rather than literal body size. The same way oversized sarcophagi and monuments have signaled importance across nearly every ancient culture. That's a real serious alternative, and it deserves to sit alongside the giant bed reading rather than being erased by it. Deuteronomy chapter 3 also calls Og directly the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, a separate Hebrew term worth knowing on its own. Rephaim shows up across the Old Testament in two different senses, sometimes naming a specific giant clan tied to the region of Bashan, and elsewhere, especially in poetic and prophetic texts, referring to the shades of the dead in the underworld. Scholars still argue over whether that's one concept split into two meanings over centuries, or two genuinely separate traditions that happen to share a name. Either way, it's more evidence that giant in the Hebrew Bible was never a single simple idea. It was a cluster of overlapping traditions, terms, and regional legends that later editors folded together. And the giants weren't a footnote to the story. They were the reason an entire generation never reached the promised land. Numbers chapter 13 sends 12 spies into Canaan, 10 of whom return terrified specifically by the size of the people they saw, sparking a panic so severe that God, in the text's own account, condemns the entire generation to wander the wilderness for 40 years rather than enter the land. Only 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, argued the size of the enemy didn't matter. The fear of giants isn't a side detail in this narrative. In the Bible's own telling, it's the specific reason an entire generation of Israelites never lived to see the land they were promised, which makes an outside, non-biblical source describing the same region, the same era, and comparably extreme heights worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. And then there's Goliath, the most famous giant in the entire Bible. And here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated than most retellings admit. The Hebrew Masoretic text puts his height at 6 cubits and a span, somewhere around 9 feet 9 inches. But the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the same story, along with the ancient Greek Septuagint translation, gives a different number entirely: 4 cubits and a span, closer to 6 feet 9. 2 ancient manuscript traditions. 2 different heights for the same man. Even within Scripture's own transmission history, the giants were never a settled number. They were a moving target, copied and recopied across centuries by scribes who apparently didn't all agree on exactly how tall was too tall to write down without checking twice. And Goliath wasn't presented as an isolated case either. Deuteronomy chapter 2 names an entire roster of giant peoples the Israelites encountered on their way into the land. The Anakim, described as great and many, tall as the Anakim. The Zamzummim, another tall people already displaced by the time the Israelites arrived. The text treats these names the way a modern military briefing might treat known enemy factions. Matter of fact, geographically specific, listed without any sense that the writer expected readers to doubt they existed. Words on a page are one thing. Egypt left something harder to argue with. The execration texts, a separate and much older set of Egyptian ritual documents, mention a group called the Anak, commonly translated as people of Anak. That name isn't a coincidence. The Anakim are named directly in the Bible as one of the specific giant clans the Israelite spies encountered in Canaan, the very people Numbers 13 describes towering over them. The execration texts themselves are a strange category of evidence worth understanding on their own terms. They're ritual curse inscriptions, written on pottery bowls and clay figurines, listing the names of enemies, rival rulers, and hostile foreign peoples that Egypt wanted cursed or magically bound. Officials would inscribe the names, then ceremonially smash the pottery, a kind of ancient sympathetic magic aimed at Egypt's enemies before any battle was fought. That a people called the Anakim, or something functionally identical to that name, appears on a list of groups considered dangerous enough to curse in advance tells you Egypt took them seriously as a threat, whatever their actual height turns out to have been. Then there's the stone record, reliefs commemorating the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BC, depict captured Shasu spies, the same people named in Anastasi I, and the carved figures show them noticeably larger in scale than the surrounding Egyptian soldiers. Kadesh itself is one of the best documented battles of the entire ancient world, fought between Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire, recorded not just in Egyptian temple reliefs, but in a peace treaty afterward that survives as one of the oldest written international agreements ever discovered. The reliefs depicting the Shasu spies weren't obscure or hidden art. They were carved prominently on major temple walls, specifically to be seen, meaning whatever image Egypt wanted to project of this people was a deliberate public statement, not a private aside buried in an administrative archive. To be fair about that scale question, because it matters, ancient Egyptian relief carving frequently sized figures by importance rather than literal proportion. A pharaoh drawn larger than his own army was standard practice, not evidence of a giant king. So the Kadesh reliefs alone can't carry the weight some researchers put on them. But stack everything together, and the pattern gets harder to wave off entirely. A written height estimate in cubits, a named people matching a biblical clan name in an entirely separate document. A visual record, however imperfect, showing the same group as unusually large. None of these on their own proves anything. Together, they're at minimum a real historical thread, not an invention. Now the honest part, because this channel tells you when the evidence is thin. No excavation has ever recovered giant-sized human remains anywhere in the Levant. Not one confirmed skeleton, not one oversized burial, not one piece of physical, anatomical evidence anywhere close to 8 feet tall from this period or region. Mainstream scholars have a straightforward explanation for the whole pattern, and it deserves to be heard in full. The Shasu were a real, well-documented nomadic people of the Levant, frequently mentioned across Egyptian records spanning several centuries, generally understood as pastoral groups, moving through the region rather than a single unified nation. They appear in Egyptian texts as raiders, as trade partners, and as military opponents, depending on the period, which tells you they were a real persistent presence in the region rather than a legendary invention. Soldiers encountering unusually tall individual warriors, in a culture without reliable standardized measurement, and with every incentive to make an enemy. Sound as fearsome as possible in an official report, could easily produce numbers like these without a single supernatural explanation required. It's worth noting how this kind of exaggeration typically worked in the ancient world. because it wasn't usually pure invention out of nothing. Ancient military reports across multiple cultures, Assyrian, Egyptian, and later Roman, regularly inflated enemy numbers, enemy fortifications, and enemy stature specifically to make a victory sound more impressive or a defeat more forgivable. A genuinely tall individual warrior, 6'6" or 6'8", in a population where the average man stood closer to 5'4", would already look monstrous to soldiers seeing him up close. And a report exaggerating that difference further, rounding 6'6" up toward 8 feet in the retelling, fits a pattern historians see repeated across the ancient world, not something unique to this one scroll. The late biblical scholar Dr. Michael Heiser, whose academic work focused specifically on this exact material, made the point directly. Heights over 2 meters, roughly 6'7", would be tall by any era's standard, but they are not evidence of anything beyond genuinely tall human beings. Modern professional basketball rosters are full of men in that same height range, walking around without anyone calling them Nephilim. That's a real serious objection, made by a real scholar who studied this material closely, and it can't be waved away just because it's less exciting than the alternative. A tall soldier reported by a frightened scribe is not the same thing as proof of a supernatural bloodline. The gap between unusually tall and biblical giant is exactly where this entire debate actually lives. And that gap is exactly where the internet has spent the last decade filling in fakes. Search giant human remains, and you'll find dozens of viral photographs, oversized skeletons next to tiny excavators, a supposedly mummified giant finger, the length of a forearm, all of it presented as suppressed archaeological evidence. Almost none of it holds up. The mummified giant finger, one of the most widely shared images in this entire space, was eventually traced back to an art project, openly built from clay and other materials by its creator, as a piece of speculative fiction, never claimed as real by the person who made it, before it escaped into the internet stripped of that context and got treated as leaked proof. That matters here for a specific reason. It means the honest evidence for biblical era giants, Anastasi I, the execration texts, the Kadesh reliefs, has spent years sitting in the same cultural space as genuinely fabricated images, and gets dismissed by association with material it has nothing to do with. A 3,300-year-old museum-catalogued papyrus is not the same category of claim as a viral photograph with no traceable origin. Treating them the same way, in either direction, either dismissing the real scroll because fake images exist, or citing fake images to prop up the real scroll, is exactly the kind of sloppy reasoning that's kept this entire topic stuck in internet mythology instead of serious historical discussion. So step back from the height question entirely and look at the word itself, Nephilim. The Hebrew term used in Genesis chapter 6, most commonly traced to the root naphal, meaning to fall, fallen ones, not necessarily fallen in height, fallen in origin. Genesis 6 doesn't describe the Nephilim as simply tall men born to tall parents. It describes them as the offspring of a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, a phrase that has generated centuries of genuinely serious theological argument over exactly who or what the sons of God were meant to be. There are three real, long-standing scholarly traditions on that phrase, and it's worth knowing all three rather than assuming the supernatural reading is the only one on the table. The first, often called the Sethite view, and historically favored by figures like Augustine, argues sons of God simply meant the righteous line of Seth, Adam's third son, intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. A purely human moral corruption story with no supernatural beings involved at all. The second, the angelic or watcher view, is actually the older reading, held by Jewish interpreters in the centuries before and after Jesus, including the historian Josephus, who wrote plainly that angels had relations with women and produced offspring who were treated with insolence for their strength. This is the reading the Book of Enoch runs with directly. The third, a royal or dynastic view favored by some modern ancient Near Eastern scholars, argues sons of God was a title ancient kings sometimes claimed for themselves, meaning the passage may describe powerful rulers and dynasties abusing their position, not literal divine beings at all. This channel has already walked through the strongest form of the second view, the angelic reading in the Book of Enoch, the ancient text that describes the Watchers, by name, angelic beings who descend and take human wives, producing children the text explicitly calls giants. Enoch isn't in most Western Bibles. It survives in full only in the Ethiopian Canaan, but it's quoted directly, by name, inside the New Testament's own Epistle of Jude, which means whoever assembled the accepted canon knew this material existed and excluded it anyway. Enoch goes further than Genesis does, naming specific watchers, describing them teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity alongside fathering these giant offspring, and framing the resulting chaos as the direct cause of the flood itself. Whether you read that as literal history, ancient allegory, or something in between, it establishes something worth remembering. The idea that unusual, oversized beings existed before the flood wasn't a one-off detail invented by a single Genesis author. It's a thread multiple ancient writers, working across different centuries, kept independently returning to. Put Anastasi I next to that older thread, and the picture sharpens. An Egyptian scribe with no theological stake in any of this, independently recording unusually large people in exactly the region and era the Bible places its own giant clans. Whether that's a coincidence of tall soldiers and frightened reporting, or something closer to what Enoch and Genesis were actually trying to describe, is the real question this scroll reopens. Here's where the two threads actually meet. For 3,000 years, the giants of the Bible existed in exactly one kind of evidence, Scripture describing its own claims, with nothing outside it to check the story against. Believers had faith, skeptics had silence. Neither side had a genuinely independent source written by someone with no reason to care how the story landed. Anastasi. One changes that math, even if it doesn't settle it. What's confirmed, without argument, a 3,300-year-old Egyptian military training letter exists, describes a people called the Shosu in the exact region the Bible names its giant clans, and gives their height in cubits at a range translating to 6 feet 8 inches to 8 feet 6 inches. That letter has sat in the British Museum, publicly catalogued, since 1839. Nobody invented it recently. Nobody doctored it to fit a modern argument. It has simply been sitting there, largely unread by anyone outside specialist Egyptology, until a research group went looking with a different question. What's genuinely disputed? Whether that height description reflects literal, verified fact, or the kind of threat-inflating exaggeration any frightened military report might produce in any era, in any army, about any unusually tall enemy. Dr. Heiser's objection is real and unresolved. No skeleton has ever backed this up. That gap matters, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of dishonest packaging this channel exists to avoid. Consider, too, how unusual it would actually be for this to be pure coincidence. Egyptian scribes had no access to the Hebrew scriptures. Whoever eventually wrote down Numbers and Deuteronomy had no access to Egyptian military correspondence sealed away in a scribal training archive. These are two completely separate documentary traditions, developed independently, centuries apart in their final written form, describing the same geographic region using comparably extreme, specific numbers. That kind of convergence between unconnected sources is exactly the sort of thing historians treat as meaningful corroboration in every other context, when it's two ancient civilizations independently recording the same eclipse, the same famine, the same king's reign. There's no obvious reason giants should be the one category where independent convergence stops counting as evidence. But here's what doesn't disappear, no matter which side of that gap you land on. An outside, non-biblical, contemporary Egyptian source independently describes an unusually large people in the same place the Bible does, using its own internal reasons for writing it down. That's not nothing. That's the first real crack in 3,000 years of you'll just have to take our word for it. It's also worth asking why this specific scroll sat quietly for nearly 2 centuries before anyone connected it to the biblical question at all. Egyptology as a discipline developed almost entirely separately from biblical archaeology for most of its history, staffed by scholars trained to read hieroglyphics and hieratic script, not to cross-reference every administrative document against Old Testament geography. Anastasi I was catalogued, translated, and filed under exactly what it looked like on its surface, a scribal training exercise. And nobody was specifically looking for giants in a document about road logistics. That's often how corroborating evidence actually gets found in this field, not through a dramatic discovery, but through someone eventually asking an old document a new question it was never originally read to answer. So, where does the honest version of this story actually end? The scroll is real, the height it describes is real, in the sense that a real scribe really wrote it down, for his own real reasons, in his own century. Whether those men were giants in the way Genesis means it, or simply the tallest soldiers a nervous army had ever personally faced, is a question Anastasi I raises without fully answering. What it does answer is smaller, and arguably more important. It answers whether the Bible was inventing this detail out of nothing, in isolation, with no outside record anywhere close to it in time or place. It wasn't. Someone else, writing for entirely different reasons, wrote down something remarkably similar. That's not proof the Nephilim walked the earth. It's proof the story didn't come from nowhere. And that distinction matters more than it might sound like at first. Every generation that has read Genesis 6 has had to decide, largely alone, whether to take its strangest verse literally, symbolically, or as an embarrassment to explain away. For the first time, there's a document sitting outside the Bible entirely, written by people with zero interest in defending or attacking Scripture, describing something close enough to the same claim that it can no longer be dismissed as Scripture simply making things up. You still have to decide what you believe about giants. You no longer have to decide it in a vacuum. That's really the through line connecting everything in this investigation. Not a verdict on whether the Nephilim were real, half-angelic beings, or simply the tallest men a frightened army ever had to face. The through line is that the ancient world left behind more corroborating fragments than most people realize, scattered across languages, cultures, and centuries that had no contact with each other. And every time researchers go back and actually check those fragments against each other, the story turns out to be less isolated than it first appeared. That doesn't settle the argument. It just means the argument is older and better documented than most people assume walking in. If banned texts and buried evidence are what keep you watching this channel, the Book of Enoch investigation goes even deeper into exactly what the Watchers were said to have left behind. It's on your screen now.